guys, it's Alice, and today I'm going to tell you about the books I've read in the first part of June. I think we should just get straight into it. The first book that I finished was Ask Again Yes by Mary Beth Keane. This is a literary fiction novel, and the story starts off with two NYPD cops who move to the suburbs and they become neighbors. And the book is just about these two families, what happens behind closed doors in both homes, the friendship between their children, and this horrible incident that breaks all of them apart. I've had this book recommended to me quite a lot, especially by a lot of you guys in the comments, and I can tell you that that recommendation was spot on because I loved this book. This book is about family, forgiveness, trauma, addiction, mental health, and love, and just so much more. And I just loved getting to know our characters in this book. I felt like all of them were complicated and complex and interesting, and I loved seeing all the different relationships between all of them and following this family through different generations and through all of these years, and just following our characters and seeing how they grew. I just loved it. I think this is a quiet book in a lot of ways, and I think that works well for this type of story. It's really readable, it's filled with detail, and even though we skip between characters and we sometimes skip backwards and forwards in time, I never felt confused or anything, and I never felt like we missed anything important, even when we skip like several years ahead in only a few sentences. I don't really know what else to say except that I just loved this, and this is exactly the type of story that I just adore, and it's perfect if you like Celeste Ng, which I feel like is the reason you guys recommended this to me so much, is because I loved Little Fires Everywhere. If you like family dramas and character-driven stories, this is just an absolute must-read, and it's one of the best books that I've read all year, and I gave it a 5 out of 5 stars. By the way, if any of you guys have any more recommendations like this and Little Fires Everywhere, I would love to know, because those are two of the books that I've given 5 stars this year, and if you watch my channel a lot, you'll know that I don't hand out 5 stars very easily. So if you have any recommendations like this, please let me know. The second book that I finished was The Kind Worth Killing by Peter Swanson. This is a mystery thriller, and the story starts off with two people who meet at an airport, a man and a woman, and they get to talking. And this man starts talking about his wife and how he's really upset with his wife, and he sort of jokingly starts talking about the fact that he maybe wants to kill her, and then suddenly this woman that he's talking to offers to help him do it. This was a really enjoyable read, but I think that maybe I hyped this book up too much in my head, and it didn't quite live up to those very high expectations. The story in here is intriguing from the start though, and I really enjoyed meeting our characters and getting to know their backstories and getting inside of their quite twisted minds. It's a very readable book, and it's a very easy book to get sucked into, I feel, and I especially liked reading about this woman that we meet at the beginning of the book and seeing her flashes to her childhood. I really loved those parts. There are a lot of twists and turns in this book, but I feel like the ones that we got at the beginning of the story were a lot more shocking and surprising than the ones we got towards the end. Like, I felt like in the last part, things started getting a little bit predictable, and I think that I was so prepared to have my mind blown because I'd built this up so much. I just didn't find the twists as shocking as I wanted them to be. Like, I was so prepared to have my mind blown, and then it wasn't as blown as I wanted it to be. A good example of what I wanted from this and what I thought I was going to get from this was some of the same feelings that I got when I read Gone Girl. Like, the twists in Gone Girl, like, my jaw literally dropped when I read that book. Like, I was so surprised and I was so shocked, And I think that because I've seen this compared to Gone Girl a lot, and a lot of people say that this is even better, I built my expectations based on that, and then it just didn't really live up to that. I also think that towards the middle of this, things start to drag a little bit, and I felt like we spent a lot of time on very uninteresting things, to be honest. And I also noticed that each of these chapters, right, they have the name of the person we're following in said chapter. And I think that if we didn't have that, it would have been a little bit difficult to tell who we were following. They are very different characters, so you would like catch on pretty quickly, but the voices aren't that distinct, I feel. And I think if they were a little bit more distinct, it would have upped this a notch. There is undeniably a lot of suspense in this though, and I really wanted to know how it was all going to end, so it was very entertaining to me. I gave it a 3 out of 5 stars, but I do think if I hadn't had such high expectations, it might have gotten a 4, but I ended up on a 3. Next, I read We Crossed a Bridge and It Trembled by Wendy Perlman. This is a nonfiction book, and it's based on hundreds of interviews with displaced Syrians. And altogether, these testimonials take us through the Syrian war and the way that it affected all of the people living through it. So I got this book because I wanted to learn and better understand the conflict in Syria, because I never really felt like I completely grasped it, and this book provided all of that and more. The introduction of this concisely explains the conflict in Syria and the progression of the war, and I found that very, very helpful. And then after that, it moves on to all of these different testimonials from all these different people. When I first started reading this, I did feel like the vignettes of all of these different people, like their stories, were a little bit too short almost. Like some of them are just a few sentences or just half a page. And at the beginning, I didn't really see what the book was doing, but then I got into it and I was like, oh, I see what this is. Because all of these different voices and all of these different testimonials, they're all puzzle pieces, and together they create this picture of what this was really like for them. And I really, really like that, because you get a very human perspective on this, as well as a sort of overview. I feel like I've gotten a much better grasp of the history and the politics of this conflict. And I will say, this is not an easy book to read. There are several parts detailing murder and torture, and it's very, very hard to read. But I feel like it's important that the book doesn't shy away from those bits, because yes, they are horrible, but it's the truth. I feel like sometimes the way that the media covers these types of conflicts, especially when they've gone on for a while, the humanity gets a little bit lost in it, and this shows us a very human perspective of it, and I think that's really important. And I gave this a 4 out of 5 stars. It's definitely one of the better books that I've read this year. Next up, I finished The Book of Edda by Meg Ellison. This is a post-apocalyptic novel, and it's the second book in the Road to Nowhere series. The first book is The Book of the Unnamed Midwife, and this book is set about 100 years after the events of the first book. And we meet this woman who lives at a settlement of survivors, and she is a raider. So she goes out and raids nearby territory for supplies. Sometimes she comes across other people, sometimes she comes across slave traders, and sometimes she comes across other women. And women are very rare in this world. There are about 1 woman per every 10 men because of the plague that has wiped out almost everyone. So the first book in the series was one of the best books that I read last year, and I think that the follow-up, was good but not great. I do like the darkness in this book, just like I liked it in the first novel, and there's a grittiness to these books that I just really, really like. I thought it was very, very interesting to see where the world had gone, and I like that the story of the woman that we meet in the first book has become like folklore in this. And I really enjoyed that. And I liked getting to know our main character. And I like that this book discusses a lot of women's issues, and it discusses childbearing in a time when childbearing is very dangerous, and you're also like the last people on earth. There are not a lot of people left. And I think there are a lot of interesting discussions around that happen in this book. I do, however, think that this book is less original than the first book, and that makes me like it a little bit less. I think that the characters in here are interesting, but they're not nearly as interesting as the characters we meet in the first book. I think that a lot of the things that elevated the first book to another level are sort of lacking in this. And I think that this is a post-apocalyptic story that we've all seen before, and that makes it a much more average book. There is a sort of brutality in the way this is written that is carried on from the first book, and I really like that. And I liked getting to see how this world had progressed. It's kind of horrifying, but it's also fascinating. And I gave this a 3 out of 5 stars. I will be reading the third and final book in the series at some point. I do have it because I want to know where it all ends, and I want to see where this world ends up. Second to last, I read The Strax on a Road by Zora Neale Hurston. This is a nonfiction book, and it is the memoir of Zora Neale Hurston, which, if you don't know, she was an American novelist, anthropologist, and folklorist. This is my first book that I've read by Hurston. I have got Their Eyes Were Watching God on my shelves, but I haven't read it yet, and I thought this was good. It was very interesting, and it really made me excited to delve into her novels. This is definitely an interesting memoir, and it sort of starts off as your typical memoir in that it starts off with her childhood and her growing up, and then at some point it sort of morphs into something else. It sort of morphs into almost an essay collection, and we get these chapters about different themes. And that sounds a little weird maybe, but it was very interesting and I really liked it. I think this book offers us a glimpse into this time period, and I really enjoyed reading about Hurston's childhood in particular and her experience of growing up. I think that was my favorite part. The writing style in this is what really gets me though. And I read somewhere that you can tell in this book that Hurston is a master storyteller. And I really agree with that. Everything in here is told through a story, and it was very easy to become engaged in, at least for me. I did notice that every once in a while it would sort of drift off to being maybe a little bit too abstract for me, but overall I just thought the writing style was excellent. I also think that the foreword in this, which is written by Maya Angelou, was excellent, and it really sort of prepares you for what kind of book this is, and it mentions the things that this book, the memoir, doesn't touch on. And I thought that was really interesting. I think that the foreword prepares you for what kind of book this is, and I feel like that made it easier to sort of get into. Overall, really glad I read this, and I gave it a 4 out of 5 stars. And like I mentioned, I do have Their Eyes Were Watching God on my shelves, but if you have any recommendations for any of her other books, I would love to know. Lastly, I finished 9 Perfect Strangers by Liane Moriarty. This is one of those books that's kind of difficult to place into a genre because I feel like it tries to be a mystery novel, kind of, but then it's actually just contemporary fiction. And the story is about these 9 people who check into this health resort for a 10-day cleanse. And this program ends up becoming something that they had not expected. So honestly, for me, this was just a perfectly average book. And I don't really have that much to say about it. It was okay. It was fine. I think the characters in here are alright. There are a lot of them. But I wasn't really that interested in any of their lives. I wasn't very invested in any of them. I think maybe I had like one character that I preferred over the others, but I think that was just because we got to know that particular character better than the others. And I think that the setting in this was okay. nothing too interesting about that either. The writing in here also is just fine to me. Like, there's nothing I can point at that I necessarily disliked, but there's also nothing that I can point at that I loved. I think that this book is too slow. I think that there's supposed to be suspense in here, but I never really felt any of it. And by the time we got to the slightly twisty bits, I just did not care. This just wasn't that intriguing to me, and I don't really have that much else to say about it. It was an okay book, so I gave it a 2 out of 5 stars. Okay guys, those were all the books that I had to talk about today. I'd love to know what you guys have been reading lately. Tell me about all of it in the comments, and I will see you soon. Bye!